So what I want to do is take you through what I call connections. This is going to be your requirements on the exam to come up with your own connections. You can kind of riff off mine, but you're not, the job here is not to just memorize my connections. It's to be inspired, by these connections to find your own connections. And I'm hoping that what you'll see is the really good connections are ones where you can figure out something that's happened in your life. So, for example, some of these we're going to come up with were actually student connections where they had questions about the health of their family and what happened. And so they were able, with an understanding of electrolytes in the urinary system, to suss this out, to work this out. Now, we've been talking about this whole semester in a way because we started off on one of the first days talking about Michael Jackson and Propofol. I'm going to try my best to use as good a handwriting as I can. So Michael Jackson took Propofol. And what Propofol does is it slows breathing, so decreases respiration. And what that's going to do is increase CO2. Now is as good a time as any to remind you of this equation where water plus CO2 can become H2CO3. And that can also split into HCO3 negative plus acid. And so anytime you see CO2, you should recognize that those two are going to work together. So if there's an increase in CO2, there's going to be an increase in acid. And if there's a decrease in CO2, there's going to be a decrease in acid. So this increase in CO2 is going to increase acid. Now, we will learn with drawings that are coming up that when you increase acid, you also increase potassium. And that's going to cause hyperkalemia. And hyperkalemia can lead to cardiac arrest. If you wanted more of an explanation for that, remember that in action potentials, this part here is caused by potassium leaving the cell. So if you already have a lot of potassium out here, then it cuts this down. And so it makes this extended. Now, we talked about in class about how that's what theoretically should happen. But what actually happens, because these channels in here respond to potassium, what actually happens is in higher potassium outside the cell, the channels will close sooner. And so you'll shorten the action potential. And when you shorten the action potential, you're decreasing contraction. And so not enough blood to heart, and then that leads to the cardiac arrest. Now the opposite can happen too in this case, and I would say read up on this case because it's one of those examples where the government does mess with healthcare. I mean, obviously during this coronavirus it's kind of a huge question of what can the government do for healthcare, but this one now pales in comparison. But it's still a good example that Terry Schiavo was thought to be bulimic, and you can look her up on Wikipedia. Now there's different types of bulimia. There's the type of bulimia where you throw up a lot, and then there's the type where you take laxatives a lot. And Terry Schiavo was thought to increase her emesis, so was throwing up. And what that does is you're throwing up acid, so you're getting rid of acid. So now we're at the opposite of up here. And so that's going to decrease potassium. And then that's going to lead to hypokalemia. And in that case, the action potential gets really long, but it's the same thing, cardiac arrest. And then death too. Well, in her case, the reason it's political is because she was brain dead, but when her husband wanted to get remarried, he thought it was time to take her off of life support. She could breathe on her own, but she had a feeding tube. And it got political because it went back and forth between the parents thinking she was aware and smiling at them, and the husband thinking she just didn't want to live like that. So he would win the court case and they'd take out the tube, and then they would win an appeal and they'd put back in the tube. Eventually, Terry Schiavo's guardianship was taken over by the governor of Florida, who at the time was Jeb Bush, which seemed like a really odd thing because I just don't know that I would want my guardianship taken over by a politician. Okay, so this is another legitimate one by a student. She had a dad who was sensitive to spicy food. So dad ate spicy food. And some of us don't react well. The GI does not react well to spicy food. And so it agitates the GI. What happens when the GI is agitated, it dumps chloride into gut. Water follows because water follows ions. Diarrhea, dehydration, because it's a bit disgusting to think about it this way, but diarrhea is pretty pure water, at least compared to the saltiness of your blood. And then that leads to an increase in potassium, because if you take away water, you concentrate your ions, and then that led to cardiac arrest. I wrote cardiac output up here, but meant cardiac arrest. And I mean cardiac arrest here as well. Or this one is one I don't know, it always still saddens me to bring it up, but her name was Laura. We'll call her Laura W. Brother had brain cancer. And that can require intense chemo. And when you kill cells again are bags of potassium. So that potassium gets spilled out, and that's going to lead to hyperkalemia. And she was always troubled because her brother was 18, and she didn't understand why he could die of cardiac arrest. Also didn't understand why right before they tried to put him on dialysis. And the reason they tried to put him on dialysis is because they killed too many cells with the intense chemotherapy. That released a bunch of potassium, and so they put him on dialysis to try and get rid of the potassium. This is 10 years ago. Nowadays we have chelators that work much quicker, so chemicals that will go in and act like a sponge to take up potassium. But in this case, it led to hyperkalemia, and again, up here and up here, that can lead to cardiac arrest. So it was really, I don't know if comforting is the right word, but it was an aha moment for her to figure out why he was put on dialysis, and also why he died so young, 18, of cardiac arrest. This is a similar one. This one was another student. Mara, aunt, had bypass surgery, gastric bypass. And when you lose weight rapidly, fat cells shrink. And that spills potassium. And that can cause hyperkalemia. And so she was undergoing gastric bypass to prevent problems with heart problems, but it actually led to cardiac arrest. So we would have talked about this during the digestion lab, and I'll do my best to draw this, but this is your gallbladder, sorry. And there is a duct here. And then this would be your pancreas. And then down here is your small intestine. And this duct right here, if you get a gallstone right there, you can block the pancreas from releasing enzymes into the small intestine. And the problem is you block the pancreatic duct. So digestive enzymes digest the pancreas. And the problem with that is if it digests a blood vessel, this is digests blood vessel, that means digestive enzymes enter the blood. And so now you're going to kill cells. And what's going to happen when you kill cells? You're going to release potassium. And that can lead to cardiac arrest. This one's a real cluster mess, and I kind of want yours on the test to be very linear, but this one's pretty bad. If you're in a burn, so you're in a house fire, so then that means you have burned skin, and it also means you've inhaled smoke. So maybe you've breathed hot air, and that's going to burn off surfactant. And that's going to make it hard to breathe because fluid is cohesive. And so in the alveolus, it's hard to increase volume, hard to increase pressure, hard to breathe in, run out of room. And so that means low oxygen loading. You're also going to kill cells. The burn is going to kill cells. That's going to release potassium. That's going to lead to hyperkalemia. And that's going to lead to cardiac arrest. Also, what's the first threat to life in a burn? So, of course, infection comes in at some point, but the first threat to life when we use something called the rule of nines to determine if enough of the body has been burned. So if more than 10% of your body has third-degree burns, or more than 25% of your body has second-degree burns, you're going to lose a lot of fluid. You'll weep fluid. And so that's going to concentrate solutes, so you're getting rid of the water, but not the ions. So that's going to lead to hyperkalemia. Another thing that can happen is you can lose fluid, lose protein, you seep out protein too. That decreases, and we're going to make a drawing to explain this. That's going to decrease your albumin, and that's going to lead to edema, and that's going to lead to decreased fluid in blood. And so all of these are going to lead to circulation problems. It's going to be a pretty big cluster mess. I always like this one because this one's relatively new, just in the last 10 years. If I were to ask the question, if an elderly patient seems to be expressing abnormal delirium, so dementia is long-term altered mental status, delirium is short-term mental status. If I were to tell you somebody in an elderly care facility all of a sudden was expressing delirium, what do you think you'd suspect? And nowadays you suspect that the person has a strong UTI, so their immune system is weaker, so a strong urinary tract infection. Bacteria metabolizes urine, and when you metabolize that urine, it makes it more electrical. It breaks down the molecules into smaller pieces, and they might be charged, so it increases electrolytes in urine, which draws fluid into the urine. That causes dehydration. That alters electrolytes. not only just in the urine now, but in body, that alters neuronal function. And that leads to delirium. Another good one is, well, really shouldn't use flu, but let's use something that causes vomiting. So vomiting can cause a loss of acid because you're throwing up acid. And we're going to draw a drawing that when you decrease acid, you decrease calcium. This is one of the most puzzling things. It still puzzles people why this happens. But low calcium leads to muscle cramping. Now, why that's puzzling is because you'd think, since calcium causes muscle contraction, higher calcium would lead to higher muscle contraction, which is what cramping is. But in this case, what happens at this step is you depolarize neurons. So the muscle in low calcium is less likely to contract because there's less calcium, but it overstimulates neurons. Got one more of these I'd like to do, but let's get a new sheet. And this is one we did with respiratory, but I just think it's an important one for everyone to understand, that pain can lead to hyperventilation. I'm in pain, I'm going to breathe more. That's going to lead to a decrease in CO2. Now the problem with CO2 is high CO2 sends blood to an area. So now if you get rid of that CO2, you decrease blood flow. So you're going to decrease blood flow to brain. And so that's going to decrease O2 in brain. Now also because of the Haldane effect, less CO2 won't kick oxygen off. So hemoglobin keeps O2, and that's going to lead to decreased oxygen in the brain. Also, one of the things that kicks oxygen off of hemoglobin is acid, but when you decrease your CO2, you're going to decrease your acid, and so hemoglobin keeps O2. And so all three of these are going to cause decreased oxygen. Now, one of the other things that's going to keep coming up over and over in this section is this decreased acid is also going to decrease calcium. It's also going to decrease potassium. I probably could have drawn these. Yeah, let's do it that way. This is going to cause a decreased potassium. Going to cause a decreased potassium. And both of these are going to alter action potentials. Potassium everywhere, muscle, heart, neurons. This one's going to alter action potentials in the heart. And potentially it could elsewhere just because calcium does that. But all of these are going to lead to altered mental function. So this is why it's important to treat pain. You never know how it's going to affect somebody. I think about it as like in alcohol. Sometimes when people drink alcohol, they get real happy. Sometimes they get real mean. And you don't know what's going to happen here. And so that's why pain has to be respected. It's unfortunate we've over-abused pain medications, and so now we can no longer treat pain. It's one of the reasons why one of the biggest things that needs to happen in medical research in the near future is find a way to sense pain that's objective, and then that's not just relying on the patient to report it, because the patient can easily lie. Things like heart rate would be an example, or one of the cool ones is how fast your heart rate goes up and down, called heart rate variability. All right, so the main point of all of this was just to show different connections. Now again, Now, hopefully, you see some of my connections, and then it'll prompt you to think about your own connections. Another way you can get started on connections is to come over to your electrolyte charts and realize your electrolyte charts are natural 4-step connections. So what we can do is find something that causes a cause. I'm going to go up to sodium. So running a marathon would cause you to sweat a lot, and when you sweat a lot, that causes hypernatremia. So now I've got a 3-step connection. Now I can choose to go this way if I want to solve the problem. So I could say, well, you're thirsty, so you grab some water, you water intake, and that brings you back to homeostasis. Or you could go over here and say, well, cells are going to depolarize, which means cells are going to get more excitable, your heart rate increases a lot, and that sends you into cardiac arrest. Or you could say that increases your blood pressure, and that causes an aneurysm. You can get cardiac dysfunction when you run a marathon and you don't make sure you hydrate. So the electrolyte charts are natural 4 to 5-step connections. You just have to find a cause of the cause. So running a marathon causes sweating. That causes hypernatremia. And then you can either go to solve the problem by saying over to one of these and say the hypothalamus senses thirst, you drink water, and that brings your homeostasis back into the norm. Or you can go this direction if you want to. So step 4 could be one of these. So it causes cells to depolarize. And then if you want a 5-step connection, you can find an effect of the effect. So what happens when these cells depolarize? Certain cells, like in the heart, are going to get too excitable, so they're going to contract too easily and not relax. And that's going to lead to cardiac arrest. All right, thank you.